you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I guess you're just waving, Taryn? Hi. I guess I just wanted to open by saying Bayrex and I are not experts in this at all. We have received zero training to do this. But
please don't leave.
Yeah, please don't leave. But I think, I don't want to speak for you, but this is something that's very important to both of us, and that we think about a lot, we read about a lot. I have represented a lot of trans people in my career, have a lot of trans people in my life. I've been to 1 million conferences. We can give you, if this is an area where you really want to build your skills, we can give you some information about great conferences and trainings that are out there to continue doing this work. I think at this point it is pretty safe to say that no matter what kind of practice you go into, you will be working with trans people whether you know it or not. And so having this kind of basic understanding and ability to be supportive and interact with trans people in a way that feels welcoming and supportive of their life experience, I think is a crucial job skill. And so it feels very important to me that we support all of you in developing those skills. And so I'm really, really glad you're all here. But again, we aren't experts, and there's a lot of expertise in this room. So please feel free to interrupt us, jump in at any time, and share your thoughts and experiences as well. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, just echo that. Actually, I was speaking with someone earlier today, a lawyer, and basically speaking about this event and also other events, and just to echo what Caitlin was saying, these conversations are happening whether you're a part of them or not. So it's a question of whether you're prepared and you are, obviously, I would argue, just a good human being. But beyond that, just know that this is happening, and you either are informed and sort of open-minded and engaged individual in those conversations, or you're not. So you either get left behind, or you are an advocate and an effective lawyer.
Yeah, and it's everything from working well with your coworkers and your clients to also CYA in terms of being an employer, right? There's a lot of these issues in terms of how they play out in the workplace, and making a welcoming environment that doesn't feel exclusive towards folks is a pretty big area of litigation right now. And so I think this information is useful no matter what it is that you're going to end up doing. Yeah. All right. Get started. So we have a PowerPoint to just give us some sort of language and anchoring information to hold on to. Bayrex and I did not write most of this. Most of it comes from the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is a really fantastic organization in New York that works specifically with low-income trans people who are navigating a variety of different legal issues. And so most of this comes from their background information and the expertise that they've developed. What? Are we want to do that right now? Okay. All right, so we're going to do a little mock interview. So in this role play, I am the attorney and Bayrex is the client, to just sort of think through how to create a welcoming environment off the bat, right? Okay. Hello, so nice to meet you. Yeah, thank you so much for coming in today. So PS, this is our first time meeting. We're just going to spend a little bit of time getting to know each other. I just want to hear as much as I can about what brings you in here today. So before we get started, I just want to get a little bit of background information. So I'm going to gather your contact information and find out the best way to stay in touch. I'm going to give you all of my contact information. So I have your name here. Can you just let me know what pronoun you prefer?
What do you mean by pronoun?
Like I prefer that people call me she and her when they're referring to me. What do you prefer?
She and her.
Okay, great. So I'm going to mark that down for the file. That will be on all of your paperwork here. The entire staff here should be aware of it. If there's ever any problems, please let me know immediately so I can take care of it. And if there's any other questions you have about interactions with other staff here, please let me know as soon as you can. Okay?
Great, thanks so much.
All right, great. All right, quick, easy, right? Do folks have other practices that you have found helpful in checking in with folks about what pronoun they prefer?
Even on an
No?
intake capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Question.
Yeah.
Would you do that with every client who walks through the door, or only if you have reason to believe that this person is someone who that conversation needs to happen?
Sure. I think best practice would be to do it with everyone, right? It can, for people who don't have background in this, it might throw them off, right? And require a little bit of a conversation. But for folks where that question, they don't feel like it needs to be a long conversation, you have it, it's done, you move on, right? But to making sure that you're just letting folks know off the bat that this is a place where they can feel comfortable, expressing themselves and having their identity recognized, I think it can be huge. Yeah. So there has been, yeah.
I just have another question. Would you do that right away as soon as you meet your client, or I just feel like saying it right away could put some people off. I don't know.
Yeah.
Would you say it?
I mean, I think part of one of the takeaways we're going to have here is that it's very hard to have universal rules, right? Because people are people, and just things, people have different personal preferences. I do think having that conversation as soon as you can, in a respectful way, in a way that is not, going to take up a lot of someone's time and energy, is a great way to just have it be done, right? And then you're not guessing, you're not, worrying, am I doing the right thing, am I doing the wrong thing? But it can also be something that you can check in about later on down the road. I just want to make sure, have I been getting your pronoun correctly? Is there anything else you want me to know? Great, no, let's move on. But yeah, and it's, I have had, I think particularly some of the elders in my life say that, they're like, oh, we have to do this question again. But I think they also understand that it is really helpful, especially for folks who are just figuring out how to navigate this. So it is, I think there's no universals. You're probably going to get a lot of different responses if you ask a lot of different people. I think most people I've worked with would prefer to just have it be asked off the bat, get it over with, and then everybody can move on. Is that a helpful answer? Is there anything else you would add to that?
Too, right?
Right.
Sometimes, even going to the previous question, you might not have an indication of there might not be a reason for you to think that's part of it, right? That people will self-identify however they want. But also, if the alternative potentially is you've been interacting with someone for 4 months and sort of misusing pronouns or never bringing it up, then that relationship also hasn't been affected for that entire period.
Right.
So I think it's not an alternative, like, is it awkward or not, or does it flow kind of naturally or not, but just, is it immediate or quicker, or is it potentially a longer term issue that then has, in other ways, undermined your relationship?
Right. And this is also one of the takeaways we want today is, as people, we make a lot of different choices about how to take care of ourselves. And we may choose to be open about our identity or our beliefs in one forum and not open about it in another, just because whatever. We want to balance the emotional labor. It doesn't feel important to us. That's a personal choice, right? And so we just want to make sure we're getting into the habit of not making assumptions that because someone seems to present in one way, that is how they always present, right? A lot of people make choices to not be open about their identity in a lot of different forums. And that can also be a question, if we really want to get into, if you're representing someone, it can also be a conversation to have about, we have a court hearing coming up, and so I just want to check in with you about, are you going to be open with the court? Do you want to be open? Can I support you in being open with the court about your identity? Or is this something that you would rather make a different choice about, right? And making sure that people are given the agency to make those choices, and understanding that a lot of that, as we're going to get into a little bit, has to do actually with survival, right? And people's ability to get through the day. So, yeah. So we just wanted to start out by talking about the idea of gender identity for folks who might be new to this conversation. And I think, again, there's no universal definitions, but there's some really useful ways to think about things here. This idea that gender identity is how we see ourselves, and so every single one of us has a gender identity, right? We have a gender that we identify with. And we all make choices about how we present that gender identity, right? Every single person does. And then some people see themselves as women, some as men, some as a combination, some as neither. Some of us have complex identities, and some of us, I would even say most of us, have identities that change over time, right? How you may have presented your gender as a child or a teenager or an adult or an elder may change, right? Your gender identity is about who you are. It's separate from the idea of who you date, right? Or what your sexual orientation might be. So just because someone has a gender identity that has changed or that is different from the gender they were assigned at birth does not mean that they date any one particular person. Does that make sense? So if someone is assigned male at birth, identifies as a woman, that doesn't necessarily mean that they date men or women or people with other genders, right? They're two separate concepts. Is that, yeah, for some folks are nodding? Okay, we're gonna do it like we're gonna turn off the camera and do a Q&A and sort of an opportunity for some small group conversation later. So if folks do have questions, we wanna make sure we get to them. I know it can be hard to raise questions in a big group.
Yeah, I think just the reason we're also going over a couple of these, just actually the idea of concepts, right? Like the idea, I think, for depending on where we're approaching this from, it's I think to get to the point of understanding, a transgender identity, you have to understand gender itself as a concept, as a construct, and that it is very fluid, and it is very personal, and so we want to sort of introduce that idea, sort of talk about that as well, so that we're not assuming that we know where everyone is and where everyone's starting the conversation at. So if there's something that you're like, that's great, but frankly, I think for most of us, there's definitely a learning curve.
All right, so just this idea of transgender as an identity. The general idea, I think, is that folks have an identity that does not match what was assigned at birth by the medical staff in the hospital, right? So the choice that was made by the medical staff that was labeled onto someone does not line up with how they identify now, right? Just because someone identifies as transgender also does not mean that they identify necessarily as a man or a woman, right? Just means that it's different than what they were assigned at birth. Being transgender doesn't also mean that someone necessarily is receiving any kind of medical treatment or medical support for their identity. Someone who was assigned male at birth, they wrote male on the birth certificate, who identifies as a woman, may choose to have surgery and take hormones, they may choose not to, right? Their identity is not defined by what sort of medical treatment they're receiving. And a note about this idea that the idea of a gender spectrum that has sort of male on one end and female on the other is pretty limiting, right? I think man and woman are sort of two identities that people can have amongst a host. And it's not necessarily that people are somewhere on a spectrum, right? That people are making choices, again, and those choices may change. They may change in terms of what form they're in. But yeah, so that we're not, it also, I think the spectrum can kind of encourage people to think, well, I have to figure out where you fall on the spectrum versus listening to people about how it is that they want to be referred to. Does that make sense? Okay.
Conversation, which is sort of like the third bullet point about sort of reducing, right, the idea of gender, woman or man, to a particularly prototypical body or sort of a majority identity of the body. And one example we were talking about when we were discussing this presentation, I don't know, maybe I actually looked up her name about it, I forgot already. But the author of Americana and a couple other books, really, self-identified shy. Exactly. Yeah.
I just say we both knew her name. We just didn't know how to pronounce it when we were looking at it this morning. Yeah.
The reason we thought of her, she I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, self-identified feminist, someone who sort of is very much kind of progressive and inclusive in many ways, who was giving an interview, and I'm not going to spend a whole hour on this, but essentially made some comments about the idea that if you were a trans woman, that sort of your experience as a woman was very different, and some argued, she was saying, there was a privilege in being a trans woman because at some point you had the privilege of being a man. And that was you can imagine, right, all the layers of the response and the criticism and her response to that. But the only reason I mentioned it is to say all of it is learning, right? And that there's no sort of immunity, right? Like, because frankly, that's my personal opinion, but part of her response was essentially like, implicitly or explicitly, like, well, I am so, woke, for lack of a better word, that I don't, this isn't controversial, like, I really am not saying that, I'm being attacked for the language, and without getting into the right or wrong of it, it's the idea that you want to be sensitive, and you want to be, what's the point of sort of reducing, right? That, I think, was the main criticism. What was the benefit or the point of reducing the idea of being a woman to any particular physical attribute when we don't do it in another context, right? If a woman has a disability, we don't say she's not a woman, even though women as an archetype would not have a disability, right? Like that wasn't a helpful conversation. So the point is it's an ongoing conversation. No one is immune. No one can say, now, the flip side of that is no one can say, oh, she got it wrong, or she stepped into it, then I don't have to learn anything. No. The point is that all of us have to learn, all of us are continually learning, and all of us have to be responsive to harm that we might cause to others based on what we say. And that the response can't just be like defensively being like, I didn't intend that. It has to be like, why did this harm you? What did I say? What are you trying to say? And continue that dialogue and conversation, which is what I'm hoping she's kind of getting to eventually. But I just wanted to kind of give that.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, just understanding, right, that, I mean, applies to everything in life, right, is that we're never done learning. And like, you know, as a person who, I have a lot of trans people in my life, I still mess up. And sometimes when people are telling me why I messed up or what I did that was upsetting to them, I don't get it. And it's just always a reminder, I don't need to get it because it's not about me, right? I just want to keep moving. And I want to make sure that I don't do it again next time. I don't have to understand every piece about it because I'm not walking in that person's shoes, right? And you know, and always I just think back to, I never assume that another woman has had the same life experience that I have had, right? So many different factors go into shaping how we grow up and all the different identities that we have. So why would I make that assumption about someone just based on them being transgender as well, right? So, yeah.
And just to very quickly, we'll move on to the next one, but the other thing we want to, and we'll get to this as well, is that attitude, like having that as your north, for lack of a better word, is a cultural, right? It will transform the culture, and it will transform communities, because there are very real, serious, dangerous consequences to transphobia, or to discriminating, or not caring for trans people that we'll get into. And it starts at that very basic level with just recognizing someone's right to self-identify, to be, to exist safely and openly. And I think when you think about it that way, right, getting to that point when it's like, well, I'm sort of confused by this, whereas you are dealing with this in a very different way, then maybe ceding some of that territory, right, in that negotiation of like, I'm a little taken aback. You're frankly very afraid of where that leads to, because if someone doesn't even recognize you at this point, then in terms of legislation or in terms of security or in terms of other rights that you may have, that grows from that. So if you don't have that lack, if you start from a lack of empathy or a lack of recognizing that that should always be your goal, then it can lead to really serious consequences as a society. So sort of thinking of how this one question or these topics will relate to sort of really large systemic issues. It's just a quick example. I mean, sometimes we get this, right? Like people are like, oh, it's just so odd to use, you know, what I think is a plural or, you know, deferring to someone else's. And I understand, you know, legal writing and all that stuff. And well, we can talk about, I'm sure, we can talk about that. But frankly, I know, and I remember one of there's a legal writing listserv. And this is a conversation that has been going on for a couple of years now in terms of like, being open to it, but just to say, first of all, as I was pointing out last week, I overheard, you know, the English language is language, it's human language, it's all, even without getting to the nitty-gritty of the history of they, but the idea that at the end of the day, language is about communicating. Language is about, are you really going to make someone's life miserable or not included, not recognized because you're a stickler of a brand, right? But regardless, if you are a stickler, the AP actually, you know, very recently embrace they as a singular gender-neutral pronoun, which means that journalists, and this is their sort of style book, they now will be using this. And these comments are actually quotes from either gender non-conforming or transgender individuals and activists who constantly were being interviewed or featured in an article. And it was sort of an irony of sorts, because it was like, what work are you doing and what are the issues you're facing? And then they would use the wrong pronoun, right? So it's kind of so they were saying, like, again, it's all about respect. It's all about recognizing someone's dignity. And again, that messiness, which I think sometimes is how people perceive it, like non-binary is sort of like this traumatizing thing. That's human experience, right? And that's what we're trying to move towards is what do you want to be called? And
right.
That's what we'll use.
Yeah.
Can I interject a couple questions?
Sure.
One, can you explain exactly what non-binary refers first two, and then my other
Sure.
question with regard to the singular they is what verb you use if you're using a singular they. Are you using a singular verb? So would you say Bob said they is coming, or Bob said they are coming, and then you have is that a singular are? I mean, that's been difficult for me to figure out how to use that.
Well, let's just use non-binary, but the grammar would be the example we did at the beginning. Like, if I identified I don't, that was a cool thing. I identified as he, him, his, right? So that you could, but I could have chosen a different combination, right? I could have said him, there. So that would answer that question because you're not using it randomly, you're using it to a specific person.
Right.
So that person would tell you use this verb that you refer to me in this other way, depending if it's not a verb.
But what if you're talking about that person? If someone asks you, do you know what time, if Bob prefers they as.
What time are they coming?
So
That would
Bob,
be the
so you
default.
use the-
Yeah.
Okay.
You can ask, but then
Yeah.
if this is a conversation with someone else, you would just assume that consistency.
And I think we've talked about this of if, again, there's a really rich conversations going on in legal writing. I'm sure there's 8 million articles being written about this right now. But I think, if you want to use it in legal writing, you could drop a footnote, and now you have a nice citation to the AP style manual that says that this is an accepted practice. But just, if you are thinking about how to introduce it, but I do understand because I do love grammar rules, but I also love the way that grammar evolves and that language evolves. And obviously, there are words that we recognize in the English language that can be harmful or stigmatizing to people, and so we find ways to work around them. And if we can go in that direction, why can't we also go in the direction of having language evolve to be more inclusive and more welcoming and positive and recognizing a different kind of experience, right? We can't just go in the language of erasure, right? And in terms of non-binary, I think you're going to get a lot of different answers. You've asked a lot of different people. There are very few universal rules. I think the basic idea with the concept of a non-binary gender, so the gender binary, right, is the idea that there's two genders, male and female, and that's it, right? And obviously we know that even within that, there's such a wide and rich complexity, right? That many people interpret their male or their female gender in a lot of different ways. And that there's so much richness in there. And so the idea of a non-binary gender just explores that, gives more language to that, and takes it further to say, well, some people don't actually need to identify as one or the other, don't feel comfortable identifying as one or the other. So their gender does not fall within the binary. Does that make sense? Do folks have other definitions they've heard that they feel would be helpful to add to that? Or is there any other language Bayrex and I have used that was confusing?
Are there other common pronouns outside of he, she, they that as lawyers, as white lawyers, we should become familiar with?
I think just going back to the basic rule about self-identification, right? And just being open to listening to people and what they want. There are some very well-known folks out there who have their own pronouns that they have come up with that they want to use. I know I had a conversation with a friend who has a pronoun that she uses that she asks people to use when they're writing about her, but in conversation, she and her is fine with her. So it's just like listening to people about what it is that they want. Like to her, the public representation of her feels different than the interpersonal conversation with her, yeah. But yeah, listening to people about what they want, and there may be different pronouns that are out there. There may not, but yeah, I think always having the other box, right, is helpful to letting people come up with whatever identification they want.
Actually, I thought we're going to show something right after. So what are the risks of what technology will do to me if I actually go to the website? But this is a helpful, just helpful URL if you want to see like an intake form, and it's really helpful to client intake form and the kinds of questions and the in-depth level.
Right.
So feel free to type that in transgenderlawcenter.org/legalinfo, and you'll see the ways in which they ask a lot of things we've discussed to make it inclusive, to give options, to have open fields, etc. But one thing we wanted to show, to give you a very concrete example, you may have or not heard of this, but I guess in February, so last month, in the Supreme Court, so there is a Title IX case that has been appealed to the Supreme Court. They've accepted it, so I think. So it's unclear how I'm going to do the rest. But it's there. And it's a case, it's a Title IX case. It's about public education and restroom and gender identity, a transgender student, I think Grimm.
Gavin Grimm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's been appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And this was a letter that was sent by a Supreme Court clerk to, actually there were two letters sent to two different organizations on the other side of the issue who had written, I think, an amicus brief on behalf of sort of the other position. And the letter, essentially they had mispronounced, for lack of a better word. They had used really the wrong pronoun for this litigant. And the clerk wrote back a letter saying, we have a rule in the Supreme Court about how you're supposed to do this. You said her, it's actually his, and if you do this again, there'll be consequences. Now, there are two things to keep in mind about this. Number one, this was a kind of an interesting little move by the clerk, and I think it was kind of, again, just acknowledging basic decency, respect for what happens. But something that I thought of later was the fact that, getting into more of the legal side of this, I am sure that one of the legal arguments that will be made against this accommodation, however you want to define it, is that it is not driven by animus, right? It is not driven by any particular attitude towards transgender students. It's not about that. It's about these other things. Doing this, if you were that person or that organization, if it was a mistake or not, it's going to signal to the people who are actually going to listen to your legal argument, well, you kind of went out of your way to do this. Like, every document up to this point had used his as a pronoun for this claim, this litigant. You went out of your way to not do that. The only reason you would have had to do that is because you are rejecting that person's identity and chosen pronoun. You know, if you were in that position, wouldn't you think, you know, when you're scrutinizing that legal argument, you're probably going to be like, well, really? Do you really not have a bias against that particular animosity against that particular identity? Is it really about all these other issues, right? Again, it might not be, but just by doing this, it signals that, right? So this is just one example of something, and frankly, it got a lot of attention because a lot of people noticed that.
Right.
And the Supreme Court, to be frank, isn't having a glitter bomb party or anything. It's not like
That's Trans 101 Part 2, is the glitter bomb party. Yeah.
not like radical, like,
right.
terrorists. I mean,
Right.
it's simply like, doesn't just stick to what we do normally.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I don't know where that came from. But
Yeah.
I'm glad it's on tape.
Yeah.
Another day edited it. Actually, I didn't show you this. Actually, one of the people I wanted to sort of have kind of Skype in with it to do so was a schoolmate of mine who was the first openly transgender student at the University of Michigan Law School. And I always, when I'm thinking about these issues, I always go back to, I mean, she was the first openly trans person I ever met. And for me, we just had a great relationship and sort of learning from each other. So Denise, and this is a quote, it was actually in the New York Times, it's public, everyone can kind of find it. But, you know, had served like a US nuclear submarine in the 60s, right? Had been married to a woman, had lived his entire life. And it wasn't until late in life that came out as trans and sort of went through reassignment surgery and all of that. But, you know, really what we're talking about is these questions of feeling completely, I mean, going through, you know, that she openly acknowledges, like, trying to commit suicide, right? Like, just because of that struggle of, like, not being able to talk and not being able to recognize. And then as she moved in life, like, finding a purpose, finding allies, finding a voice, and having that voice recognized. But I always think about sort of something that, you know, now, being openly trans was a couple years ago, so, you know, I'm 63 and having gone through this amazing life, but also really overcoming and dealing with a lot. So as you think about, I want to give like a just very personal, specific story. I think sometimes in the abstract, it's hard to kind of think about these questions and to understand that this is what one person's life was and how different it could have been had she not felt acceptance, had there not been a lawyer because there's a longer story, so I wanted her to test that but couldn't. But there's a story of being discriminated against, being fired, sue the corporation, or wanted to sue the corporation, no lawyer wanted to take the case because it was suing based on gender identity expression. Eventually one lawyer did, she won the case, made, as she said, made him rich. Because it was a big case. And eventually sort of decided to go to law school, et cetera. But it's also a good segue into what we also want to talk about, which is what we had to talk about at the beginning, how there's questions of pronouns and identity and recognizing these concepts, how that awareness helps us combat and battle really serious systemic consequences of transphobia.
Right, and so just thinking about that, this is not just about making sure you get someone's pronoun right to make their day better. It's that not recognizing someone's identity in terms of their life experience has really, really serious consequences, right? And so I was thinking this morning, just as I was thinking through having this conversation, just going back and thinking about being in public school. I went to a really well-funded, pretty lovely public school in Chester County through K through 12, and how many different instances I can remember of kids getting picked on, in some cases really viciously, for their gender identity, right? And kids who may have had a sense of how they wanted to be respected. Probably not, because they're kids. They may have just been figuring that out. And how those consequences can follow you for the rest of your life, right? Kids who are being picked on and bullied in school don't have the same opportunities as kids who are not, right? They start to lose those opportunities so quickly because of the systemic consequences of the fear of welcoming trans people. And so it starts with dropping out of school for people who are rejected by their families, losing that support and stability early on, right? Which can then become a cycle of losing out on educational opportunities, losing out on employment opportunities, not having a way to survive. For people who do have employment opportunities, then facing employment discrimination, right? Being pushed out of their workplace because of the way that they present, which can be everything from a vicious culture of harassment to people explicitly being fired because the employer doesn't know what to do, right? The lack of health care. And so the speakers that we're going to have next week, Naima can definitely go into this in terms of what they've been working on at the state level. But the issue of access to health care, it is about people being able to access health care related to their gender identity, right? So people who do want access to gender-affirming surgeries or hormones or any other kind of treatment. There's plenty of information out there about the correlation, as you can imagine, between having access to health care that actually recognizes who you are and your ability to survive, right? To live longer. But then it also comes down to everything from people who don't even want to go in because when they have a cold, because they don't want to deal with having to get over all the hurdles of dealing with their gender identity in the medical environment, right? And it's a different issue, but I think it is similar to people who avoid going into the doctor because they don't want to get questions about other health issues, right? I have a friend who is trans who had hurt her knee when she was playing hockey and went in to see the doctor, and the doctor started asking her questions about her gender identity. And she was like, I'm here for a specific reason. What does this have to do? And it wasn't just the basic, let me make sure I get your pronoun right, but like all these other questions about the treatment she was receiving. And she was like, I can't deal with this stuff. And so people start to avoid going to the doctor, right? Probably because they can't access the kind of treatment that they need to recognize their gender, but then also because it just becomes a really uncomfortable and painful environment where they're forced to revisit all these questions every time they interact with someone, which then leads to really serious health issues, right? And so I'm trying to remember what is the next slide, if it's so this is how folks who are trans are disproportionately impacted by the criminal system, right? Especially when we're talking about people of color, especially when we're talking about trans women who I think experience some of the most aggressive discrimination, harassment, and violence. As folks don't have the educational opportunities, don't have the employment opportunities, and are sort of forced to find other ways to survive, they then are viewed as inherently suspect by law enforcement, who frequently assume that they're breaking the law just by virtue of their gender identity, right? And so then are disproportionately represented in a prison. I work with a lot of people who are in prison, who are coming out of prison, and I don't know that I know anyone who has been incarcerated in a state prison in Pennsylvania who doesn't know trans people, because there are so many trans people in prison. Like the representation is really disproportionate to people's actual representation in the population, because it is so hard for people to figure out how to survive, and that and then people get caught up in this cycle once they're in prison. They're picked on, they're bullied, they're harassed. There's a million studies showing that they're subjected to obviously no sexual assault is acceptable, but just really high rates of sexual assault compared to other people in prison. They fight back, then they're in prison for more time, right? So the cycle continues. So all of this is just to say that respecting someone's gender identity has a really serious long-term impact, right? It's not just about making sure that people feel comfortable in your law office or the classroom. While those are really, really important, the combination of all of these things actually mean whether people, in many cases, can continue to live, right?
As you think about being an ally, right, in terms of like that, building on that, also a question in the spaces you are outside. I mean, definitely, at law school, in your classroom, but also at home with your friends, with your family, the extent to which you are able to raise these questions and push back on these ideas and notions. Again, that is another way in which slowly, surely, society, right, starts to pick up on it, because a lot of this is either unknown or allowed, or worst case scenario, sort of openly endorsed. But that's another thing you can do. It's just like being like, well, did you know this? Were you aware of this? Again, not putting the burden on the people who are already victimized to sort of have to, on top of that, advocate for themselves and somehow change policy and laws when they're already not incredibly powerful in the system. And again, as you can tell, we did not put this together. So if you can't read them right now, and you want to see more of them far beyond that, then as Kayla mentioned, it's a Rare Law Project, so srlp.org.
They also have a really great one about disproportionate deportation. So the fact that people who are trans, who are immigrants, because of this cycle of criminalization, are also overrepresented in deportation rates, which is definitely something I witnessed when I was in legal services.